said, we're an all-volunteer organization. We're not even a nonprofit, but what we are is basically a statewide steering committee organization that works with all of the different players that work in the digital inclusion space. So this is everyone from the state library to the local public libraries to the big internet service providers. The reason that we're not a 501c3 is because, as many of you know, working in government settings or system settings, there oftentimes are restrictions on serving on board of directors and being attached or financially responsible for other organizations other than the one that you work for. And so we've made the decision to structure ourselves more informally. We have some nonprofits we work with when we do have to expend money and write grants and that kind of thing. But we operate in a public and pretty, well, somewhat informal way. And I currently serve as the secretary of the steering committee, where I help manage our website and do a lot of our trainings and that type of thing. Basically, our goal is to work with all of the different providers just to expand and enhance digital equity throughout the state. So first off, I'd like to ask you all, what do you think the digital divide is?
I want to say it's the difference between me helping my 4th grader with their homework online versus me just trying to access Facebook. I can't do it.
Absolutely. To break it down, we use the term digital divide to refer to the gap between individuals, households, businesses, and areas at different levels as far as it goes to accessing information and technology. And there's a variety of ways that this manifests itself, but I'll get into those in just a moment. We commonly think of digital access only around technology. So you mentioned Facebook, which actually leads into our second side of things, which is the skills side of things, and I'll dive into that. Many folks, when we think about digital equity, we're only, again, thinking about access to high-speed internet. But as I'm sure you all are aware, communications technology, access to the internet, all of those things can create unique vulnerabilities for survivors and victims. And as we think about an increasingly digital world, there's been a tendency to want to minimize the importance of internet or the importance of communications. And I would just remind you that we recognize as a society how important our digital tools are and our digital technologies, that we've made interfering with a communications device a crime, because we recognize that in an increasingly digital world, we rely on technology for so much more than just entertainment. We're relying on it for telecommuting to medicine now. Many of us are, like today, using it for work and professional development, childcare, education. So access to technology is way more than an added benefit. It's a necessity for the vast majority of people. And the digital divide speaks to that access to technology and also skills in terms of being able to navigate the digital ecosystem that we've created. So I'm going to talk about 4 different ways that digital equity manifests itself. First, it manifests itself economically in terms of the buying power or the economics of access. It manifests itself geographically in terms of your physical location oftentimes determines your access to technology or communication services. Generationally, which is something that was just mentioned, and I apologize that I can't see your names, or I would have responded by name, but generationally, many of you, I saw some little ones on camera as we were getting started, and I think all of us are amazed at how quickly little ones can just pick up technology and just run with it. Whereas I'm getting to that age where I'm starting to see people who are younger than me who are able to access things and do things that I have no familiarity with. So it manifests generationally. And then technically, it manifests in terms of the technical skills required. So as things get more complex and as we increase our technological capacity, people's skill levels or ability to technically interact with these technologies and skills, with these technologies and communication services can be reduced based on their technical level. And obviously, as we talk about these, I don't separate them. They're all interconnected. As you know, shared risk and protective factors work in a number of ways, and this is true of digital equity as well. So I'm really excited to be here today. We had to build our presentation from scratch because we had not talked or thought very much about what digital equity would mean for victim advocates. And so I want to give a couple of you an opportunity. I've given just this quick, brief overview. I'm interested in hearing from you just based on the 4 things that I've already talked about: geographic, economic, technical, and generational issues. I'm interested in hearing how you think this presentation can relate to your work, just based on those 4 things. I'll go back to those. We're going to do some scenarios and talk through these concepts specific to victim advocates. So if you don't have feedback now, I can move ahead and we'll come back to each individually.
I just was going to say, I feel like it just simply is because of COVID and everything. The technology and how we're communicating with our clients has changed so much that, all of these things matter now.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I like that, and I agree with you. And I imagine, my experience working with government agencies is you have privacy requirements and security requirements that maybe private industry doesn't have or hasn't embraced necessarily. So I think of Zoom, and Zoom is not approved as a communications tool for many government agencies. But Zoom is very familiar for a lot of I'm assuming it would be very familiar for a lot of your clients because it's being used in school settings and in community settings. And so that divide, that access is threatened by even the technology we're using. So thank you for that. Anyone else? Was that a chat? I can't see them when I'm presenting. So if it was for me, would someone mind reading it?
I can read it for you. Alan says, I'm in rural Utah, and a lot of our clients don't have internet, are older, and are isolated from friends or family that do have internet. We've had to help clients view their court hearings at our office. And then I'll let you respond to that one a little bit, and then there's one more.
Yep, I'm going to put that one in the parking lot because that's a specific example that I can. The example that I have, we'll get into that pretty quickly. So if there's another one, let's move on to that one, and I'll come back to the one that was just presented.
Yeah, Jasmine says that generationally and economically.
Absolutely, so I'm going to go ahead and move on, and we'll come back to these. And as I mentioned, I don't view them as individual silos. They all interact with one another. And you all, I know, see this in the unique vulnerabilities that survivors have and that victims of crime have. We generally see, someone who's struggling economically also faces access generally because of geographic location. And many of these are co-occurring issues. So I'm going to move on to the next section of this, which is relating them to these vulnerabilities. And instead of just thinking about them as abstract concepts, I'd like to, as we move forward, get into specific examples from you and hear from you all how you've been addressing these issues, or if there's things you haven't been able to address, maybe we can talk through some of those scenarios. And I might be able to provide some feedback on ways that you may be able to address those issues. So first, the digital divide absolutely affects victim advocates. I know that you all recognize this. I just think this is a key takeaway. And it really comes down to 3 areas of vulnerability, which is economic, geographic, and generational. And bouncing back just a little bit, I had technically listed here, but for practical purposes, I believe that the first 3 ultimately result in that last technical vulnerability. So for simplicity's sake, I'm combining them only into these 3 categories. But remember that these vulnerabilities feed into the ultimate, the skills vulnerability and that technical vulnerability. So I could not come up with good photos, so we are going with stock photos today because I couldn't find good photos. But economic vulnerabilities. So one of the things that I'd like to talk through is the legacy of redlining. And redlining has created a cycle of neighborhood decline. And this is really applicable to urban areas. So for victim advocates that are working in Salt Lake County and in our urban areas, we cannot ignore the legacy of redlining. And redlining was a series of processes, some laws, some informal policies, and some cultural norms that essentially kept people of color from purchasing homes in certain neighborhoods. And law enforcement, the criminal justice system, community councils, neighborhood organizations, even realtors were all engaged in practices that prohibited people of color, whether in practice or by law, from securing property and owning homes in neighborhoods, in higher quality neighborhoods. And essentially what this did is it created a boom and a bust cycle for neighborhoods that left some neighborhoods vulnerable, particularly those with high numbers of people from communities of color. And it made others wealthier neighborhoods. And you see this very starkly for those in Salt Lake City on the east-west divide. So as soon as you cross I-15 heading west in Salt Lake City, you have increases in vulnerabilities, you have increases in health disparities, you have fewer investments in things like high-speed internet or fiber. You have a higher percentage of renters, you have a higher percentage of people on Section 8 housing. So these economic vulnerabilities can be generational. And redlining, you can almost perfectly draw a map of the neighborhoods that were redlined and overlay them with maps of good internet access, with good libraries and public services, and without fail, you can, and there are some exceptions, obviously, but largely areas that were redlined and had highest rates of economic and racial discrimination through redlining have the worst access to technology and are on the negative side of the digital divide. So then the other thing that I would add is lower wages and economic recession decrease or inhibit access. So right now and I'm sure you all are seeing this in your work, we are facing an economic crisis that is somewhat divorced from Wall Street or from the stock market. And so the reality on the ground, especially for lower wage workers, for workers who are more essential, for people who work in the restaurant industry, there's a great deal of economic uncertainty, which results in decreased or inhibited access. So folks can't buy a new phone if it breaks. If their screen cracks, they can't get a new one. They may have to cancel their internet access, or they may not have it at all because they can't afford it. And all of these things feed into the digital divide. There's a private and a public responsibility here. And in Salt Lake City, our libraries have been closed since March. And so many folks who don't have internet access or access to phones or fax machines, scanners, all of those types of things, they depend on libraries very, very much. And with the library being physically closed, they've lost access to those services at a time when we're also facing this economic crisis. And so many folks have lost their safety net in terms of access to digital resources. And then co-occurring crises can also decrease or inhibit access. So when I think about this, what I'm thinking about is housing instability. I'm thinking about people who are losing their jobs. Maybe they've lost a loved one has passed away due to COVID-19, or we've also seen a spike in drug overdoses and suicide. And so all of these different crises can feed into loss of access. And so you imagine, I imagine older adults who maybe depend on a child for caretaking, and maybe that child now has to isolate because they have been exposed to COVID, or maybe that child has passed away. And so that older adult may not have access to a cell phone and to technology because that child was providing that access or helping foster that. So as far as economic vulnerabilities, I'm also interested in hearing, and I'll take some notes so that we can come back to them, but what are some things that you're seeing economically from your clients? And I know this is unique to victim advocates, which is why I'm asking the question. Have you seen issues, say, with Section 8 housing vouchers, or what are you seeing? I've tried to cover the big three, but I'm interested in specific examples as well.
I know for me, Section 8 housing is not even available. It's a waiting list everywhere. So I'm definitely having challenges with that.
And where are you at?
Well, I cover actually the whole state, but I have numerous people in Salt Lake County that we've been trying to get on Section 8 housing, and I can't get through to anybody, and you can't even be on a waiting list to be on a waiting list.
And I, having worked a little bit with Section 8 housing in the past, many folks who use vouchers, when they do find a property, it often isn't equipped with the best equipment, or it doesn't have high-speed internet. So yeah, that's interesting. What else are folks seeing?
Due to the pandemic, Legal Aid Society has gone pretty much completely online. And so they have to have access to the internet and to a phone in order to even file for a protective order.
Mm-hmm. And that aligns with what we're seeing in the community. So in my neighborhood here, my neighbor the other day came over to ask if I had a scanner because the Tooele court requires that they scan and email all their documents in, and they don't have access to a scanner. So it's interesting when we have this abrupt shift to technology where it works for a lot of folks, it does leave other folks more vulnerable. And that's very interesting. Are you seeing similar things with document requirements and scanning and that type of thing in courts?
Absolutely, yes.
So what are you doing to help promote scanning and that type of thing? Are you able to provide that at your building? Are you shut off? What kind of options are you offering to your clients?
Right now we're just inviting everyone to come to our building, use our internet. We can email any files or fax or scan or whatever needs to be done, because it seems like our office is really the only avenue at this point.
Mm-hmm. And again, it goes back to those libraries being closed and the just quick transition for things that have happened. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on to the next one, which is geographic vulnerabilities. So this came up earlier, but the physical location or geographic location also creates these vulnerabilities. So large distances and natural features can make deployment of internet or other resources more difficult. So you can imagine that a city and I'm going to struggle, but I imagine Kanab or Moab, some of these communities that are pretty, geographically dispersed from urban areas, but then also have unique natural features. The topography there can make it difficult to deploy internet. So even getting a satellite broadband was explained as this great thing that was going to help everyone in rural areas, but as we've seen, there's been a really patchwork deployment of those resources. And then the other thing is thinking about older adults in communal living. So I think of nursing homes, I think of these different scenarios, and especially in more rural areas, what we tend to see is that there tends to be one nursing home, or there tends to be one assisted living or one communal living arrangement for older adults. And what that can end up doing is, if that facility doesn't have internet or doesn't provide that kind of support, older adults can lose access or never have it to begin with. And we see this again, in particular in smaller communities that have one facility as opposed to multiple facilities. But that market access can make it almost impossible for older adults to have access. And then large distances and natural features can make it more difficult to attend public classes. So thinking specifically on the times that I've been to smaller communities, you may have people who live multiple hours away from their local library or from an elementary school, or the community may not even provide classes. So I know here in Salt Lake County, where I live, we have our senior centers provide intro to Facebook, and they can help people troubleshoot on their phones, and they do classes on very basic skills that folks need to bridge the digital divide. But rural areas may not have access to those same things. And those large distances can really be an inhibitor in terms of helping older adults or folks with low skill be able to navigate those things. So as far as geographic vulnerabilities, I'm interested in hearing how these three things resonate with you, and what, kind of what you're seeing as well.
You have Nancy in the chat, I think referencing to the slide before, but she said, we ended up getting a Wi-Fi hotspot and a printer scanner that we take with us so we can help clients with documents, etc., that they need to provide for resources. And
that is a great solution. But I'm sure even in you doing your work that you see how difficult that type of solution is, that you have to remember the hotspot, you have to remember everything, and it even creates difficulty for you as the person with resources to provide that service. So I really like that example, and I think that's a great idea. Anyone else?
I just kind of wanted to talk about a little bit, like, as I'm listening to this, how sometimes this, going back to that like empowerment model, most victim advocates, that's what we're striving to, is empowering. But if we also are the only ones that have access to all these resources and they're not able to access them without us, that takes away some of that empowerment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it creates a dependency cycle on you, right? Where that person will depend on you for all of these things in a way that that can make them vulnerable in other ways.
Another chat, Marguerite says, huge challenge my team and I have come across is working with individuals that have limited access and a language barrier. It's challenging even creating an email.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought up language access. I believe that's on my next. No, it's not. But language access, that's something that I think that we all maybe take for granted, especially now when you see technology on like Facebook, where Facebook automatically translates posts. But when you think about the unique and technical language that we have to use, especially when it comes to, say, setting up an email account, that first the barrier is even having access to the internet, and then having the skills to set it up. But then imagine, and I imagine this is something that you're dealing with, that you may have folks who speak English as a primary language, and say you're trying to communicate to a Spanish-speaking client, and you have to use very technical language in terms of setting up an email account, and there may not be a direct translation. This is something that we see all the time with the digital divide, is that it goes back to that skills, that technical vulnerability, which is you may have folks who know how to use the internet, but if there's not the technical ability to communicate in similar language, you can ask for one thing, and the person who's on the receiving end of that can do an entirely different thing while still following your instructions. And I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. It's something when we get to the scenarios that I'd like to talk through. So the last area of vulnerabilities is that older adults are adapting to changing technology with little prior experience. And the thing about our increasingly digital world is I've seen it kind of both ways, where you have younger people who are unwilling to help older people adapt and to take the time to teach and to take the time to bring other folks online. And then there's a great deal of frustration that we see generationally too, where older adults feel left out and don't feel that these institutions or that these resources were even made for them. And so there can be a great deal of opting out, if you will, where folks will just say, I can't learn this. It's too frustrating and I'm not even going to try. But as our world moves increasingly more digital, the more folks we have on the wrong side of the digital divide, the more vulnerabilities that exist. So an example of why this is so important is we all know about Facebook, and some of us have it, some of us hate it. But at the end of the day, especially right now where there's so much social isolation of older adults, that may be the only communication platform they have with family members. So while we may trivialize Facebook as a waste of time or a time suck, for someone who is isolated, it may be the only way that they're seeing what their grandkids, their nieces and nephews, their children are doing, because of the way that our communications work. And so it's not only is it necessary, but it's of vital importance that we help everyone bridge the digital divide, and that we all do our part to bring folks up to comfort level. And I've talked about this on Geographic as well, but it's applicable here generationally. Older adults in communal living may have less access. And again, it goes back to that nursing home example that I provided, where older adults in nursing homes may not even have internet access. That may not be provided in their assisted living. And so they don't have access to Facebook unless they have a cell phone. And there's just a variety of ways that creates a vulnerability. And the other thing about communal living is there may be less opportunity for older adults in these types of living arrangements to have the skills necessary. So we see this issue of leapfrogging, where you have a younger generation essentially leapfrog an older generation. And what I mean by that is this impatience that comes from younger people with helping teach older people to use technologies or resources. They may get frustrated, the young person may get frustrated and just do it for the older person instead of helping do skill building. And as we talked about on the last example, that creates kind of a dependent cycle where that older person doesn't learn to navigate or doesn't develop those technical skills, and thus unique vulnerabilities are created. Because they may get to a situation where they've done something and they feel stuck, they don't know how to undo something, they kind of just maybe fumble through, and that can create some unique vulnerabilities, especially as it relates to financial crimes, sexual exploitation, just a variety of different things. And the other thing is, this is applicable to young people as well. It's not always older people who are vulnerable in digital spaces. You have an entire generation of young people who are now growing up. So the generation born now will not remember a time before cell phones, and they will likely not remember cassette discs because CDs, they won't exist by the time that they enter adulthood or teenagehood. And so they have an entirely different level of comfort with online spaces and with digital technologies, which makes them vulnerable in their own ways, especially when we look at sexual exploitation, financial exploitation. Every day it seems that there is a different situation in the news where a young person was using a technology that they were comfortable with, whether it's Fortnite, whether it is Instagram, whether it's Robinhood, the investing app. I saw a situation the other day where a young man had invested in the stock market back in March on Robinhood, and using this app, he was able to invest like $150 or something of his money, which was a lot to this young man. And the market did what's called an inversion, where it showed a negative balance, and that made him so distressed that he ended up dying by suicide. And so that's an example of a young person with vulnerability where they instantly trust technology without necessarily having the skills or the guardrails to protect themselves in those spaces. And then this last one, this is an area of vulnerability that's a little interesting, but it comes around the idea of media literacy. And the way that I can make this most applicable to victim advocates is thinking about the way that survivors access information on the internet. And I've said older adults here, but predatory behavior or predatory practices prey on everyone, regardless of age. So I don't want to give the impression that it's only older adults that have this vulnerability, but I will say that what we see is older adults tend to have worse media literacy than younger people, especially in online places. And so an example of how that I can see that manifesting for you all is in the rise of these home sexual assault kits, which should be banned, shouldn't be allowed, but they are. You had this technology that's arisen. So genetic technology like Ancestry.com and Family Tree has given us the ability to do at-home genetic tests. And a side effect of that is that this entire cottage industry of at-home testing is rising. So you have at-home HIV tests, at-home pregnancy tests, at-home sexual assault kit tests. And what we're seeing is that without media literacy skills, when an advertisement for one of those comes across on Instagram or Facebook, and when I finish explaining this, I'm interested to hear if you've seen this, but you may have, a person who experienced sexual assault who sees that advertisement and rushes out to buy one rather than engaging with legitimate services that you all provide. And conversely, what we see with older adults is a tendency to share before sanitizing. So the practice of sanitizing before sharing, it works really well with COVID. It also works really well with online information. But when we see a news article or when we see something written online, there's a tendency to read the headline and share it without reading the content. And this has really left older adults particularly vulnerable to scams, to people taking advantage of them. So there are some generational vulnerabilities here. And I'm interested, the person at the beginning that brought up being in a rural area, I'd like to hear from you about how you see the three of these interacting and specifically how these generational vulnerabilities are playing out for everyone else?
Okay, certainly there's a lot that's been playing out for our population. We see the issue with the kind of, you mentioned the leapfrogging happening a lot, and it becomes a question of confidentiality as well, a lot where we're going, okay, well, we need to get this victim looped into this court case, but they don't have an email address, and we can't be sending, we have to bring them in to get releases so that we can send them the information to their niece or whoever's helping them with the video. We've also seen a number of issues where, as we know, the domestic violence situations happen between family members. And so we've got a son who they've got a protective order against. Well, the son was the only person that knew how to work the computer in the home, but he's the problem. He's the perpetrator. And so we've had to kind of get people to come in, and then with people without access to transportation and things, trying to get them to come in and scan stuff, for example, has been difficult. And so we've taken to asking them, they do have a cell phone that is camera capable. And so they'll take a photo and send that to us over the cell phone signal and try to get what we can in terms of pictures of papers and documents. And we've been working with the court to allow those. And it's just been, there's a lot. It's been a lot of moving pieces and a lot of case by case figuring out what we can do for this specific person and their specific situation.
Absolutely. And a little bit of a follow-up question. Do you find, or have you seen where that leapfrogging is occurring? And I'm say a case of translation, you brought up confidentiality, but have you seen that being used against victims in court or in those types of situations where maybe there was translation done and then the victim doesn't understand, or there was a miscommunication and that's being used against them? Have you seen that yet, or is that a concern?
I haven't seen it in a criminal case, but we had one report where somebody who had been helping one of our clients translate all of their legal documents from Spanish to English had basically, there had been a fight between them, and so they went over to, it was a civil suit, and they actually took all those documents, stole them from him, and committed that crime, and took them to the other side of the suit and gave away all the evidence and things. And so we're aware that it's really tenuous to have friends, family members be the translators, because it's all predicated upon that relationship staying solid. And as soon as it turns sour, all of a sudden they don't have access, or in the worst case scenario, they start really getting in trouble in courts.
Absolutely. So the scanning has come up a couple of times, and I have a question from folks from Utah Office for Victims of Crime. But does Voca funding pay for scanning services? So if you have a victim who has to scan a bunch of documents at a FedEx, is that covered under Voca's definition of allowable expenses?
To be honest, I don't know, and I don't think we have any grant analyst on, but I do know, like, for victim service providers, they would easily be able to purchase a scanner. But I would have to ask for sure, and I can send a email while we're continuing to talk to see if I can get that answer for it. But I would feel like that might be, but Utah Office for Victims of Crime goes as a reimbursement. So the victim would have to be able to front that ahead of time. And so that would cause a burden, I assume, on the victim. But let me see if I can find out the answer for that.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I bring it up because I've been working with this family here in my neighborhood and scanning documents for them, but they were told by the court that they had to print off documents, and the court referred them to Kinko's. And Kinko's charged them $81 to print off 9 sheets of paper that are free to print offline because they were classifying them as legal documents. And that's when we start thinking about solutions. referring folks to Kinko's or to FedEx or to these different resources, it can help bridge the digital divide, but I bring it up because there is a cost there. And I was just absolutely furious when I found out that they were charged as much as they were. And then the first time they went back to scan, I think it was $13 to scan those very documents. And so being able to provide a scanner and that type of thing is a really good strategy in terms of helping folks navigate this. But as I'm sure you all know, getting folks to even come into your office for scanning can be difficult, regardless of the distance that someone has to travel. Are there any other ways that generational vulnerabilities are showing up? I'm really interested to hear from victim service providers that are working with communities of color, intergenerational communities, immigrant communities. Are there unique generational vulnerabilities there that maybe look different or that have a different feel?
Not directly related to that one, but just in the chat, Wendy says that they have purchased cheap cell phones that have Wi-Fi capability and unlimited data monthly cards to be able to give to individuals so that they can be empowered to access technology on their own. This is an addition. Oh, go ahead. Sorry,
that's great. Do you find that folks know how to use them? Is there any skills support that's provided? Or are you noticing that there's any skills issues in terms of folks being able to use those?
Wendy, have you guys noticed, is there a learning curve?
We're about 80%, we're pretty technologically savvy, and about 20% either with a language barrier or a lack of understanding. We've had to help them set up the phone, help them create an email, show them how to access that data or where they can take a class to learn some of that technology.
And are you in a rural community or an urban community? Do you have a library nearby?
So we're downtown Salt Lake, so we have plenty of options. We're not running into problems finding a signal. It's more the what to do with the signal when we found it.
Great. Interesting. All right. Anyone else seeing anything unique? I think there was a second part of what Wendy had said, and I cut you off, Rochelle. Sorry.
She just said this was in addition to helping individuals use our program-based technologies. So that being said, though, when you had talked a little bit, so what actually kind of spurred our conversation to inspire us to bring Utah Communities Connect was really talking about those underserved communities. You know, the Navajo Nation at the time, you know, and how were some of these communities going to access services? So we've talked a lot about clients that were already a client, but how does just a victim of crime find, you know, an agency? And is your website, you know, is it going to appeal to victims of color or, you know, other disabilities and things like that? So that's what really kind of got this conversation started about the digital inequity and how do those other underserved populations access us, or how do we help them reach us?
Absolutely. So I'm going to move to the hypotheticals because that's really good. I wanted to spend a large amount of time with you all where you can bring up issues and we can kind of talk through strategies. The other thing that we do as an organization is where we're connected with all of these different service providers and all of these different resources. What I'm going to do today is we'll talk through some hypotheticals and issues that are coming up. And if I feel confident answering those questions, like about the website issues and access for folks who are at the very beginning of this process, the ones that I can't answer specifically, what I will do is I will take back and I will make sure that I get answers to you. And then I would like to make sure that I will provide you all with a list of resources and information and contacts based on the questions that come up today, so that you can troubleshoot with other people on the steering committee who can talk to your specific case or to specific organization for the ones that I can't answer. But let's start with the accessibility of websites. I'm interested to hear how many of you have language accessible websites. How many of them are in, let's just start with English and Spanish to begin with. And what is your capacity, or how have you done in terms of translating materials and that kind of language accessibility? I'm assuming it's like many other industries where when we have someone who speaks fluent Spanish involved or working at the organization, we do pretty well in terms of having those materials provided and being able to do that. But when we don't have that resource, we tend to fall down a little bit. Is that similar to what you all are seeing?
Hi, this is Marguerite. So a lot of the population that we work with are mostly Spanish-speaking clients. So a lot of times, if there's material that is not available, my team will typically translate it for them, or verbally will read it to them in Spanish. I mean, they'll read it in English internally, but then translate it to where the client can understand it, because many times there is not material that's offered to their native language. And so many times is like, for example, for police reports, if I'm reading police reports because clients are not aware of what it states in the police report, I will read it and translate it verbally and word for word for them. So it helps them understand that. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken.
Okay. And are your police reports and such available in Spanish, or are they all in English?
No, they're all in English, and that's why when we talk to the survivors, we'll translate it verbally over the phone with them. Any information that is in English, it's not provided in Spanish. That's how we normally will do it, and it takes extra time. I mean, we can spend, instead of reviewing a police report with someone that is an English speaker, 30 minutes maybe. With a Spanish speaker, it could be an hour and a half, because trying to explain to them in their own native language, and then they have additional questions and whatnot. So many times it does take extra time when you are interpreting for clients, or trying to be able to provide that material to them in their native language.
And what are you communicating primarily with your clients electronically, or like doing Zoom calls with them? And if so, when you provide a translator, how are you making that work? Or are you still in person?
So a lot of the majority of our clients, I'd say more than 90% of our clients are Spanish speakers, and very limited English. So a lot of times what we've done is, many times our clients prefer over the phone or text. Basically, that's their means of communication. So when we are speaking to them over the phone, it's typically I'm on the computer, and then I'm kind of helping them through that process. My team's also through the computer. They're filling out whatever needs to be done. They get verbal agreement over the phone, then they'll send out the release of information through mail. I mean, we've had to try to really be creative especially during COVID, because it's been a challenge. And so we have to really try to accommodate our clients that we're working with. And many of our clients do not even use email, to be honest. Like, I'd be surprised how many would utilize emails, but the majority of our clients is text and over the phone. They just don't have the ability and the skills to be able to use Skype, or, hey, let's set up an email. Well, I have no idea how to even open a page on the website. So it's been kind of a big challenge, and we all had to really be creative during COVID.
And what are you in a rural community or here in the Wasatch Front?
So yeah, we're in Salt Lake City, and so we serve basically everyone in the state of Utah, all the way from like Wendover to Park City to Provo to Ogden to anywhere in Utah. And so we have 4 community health workers advocates that are stationed in different areas, but right now they're all working virtually, and so it's been a bit challenge for getting certain documents processed and whatnot.
And what would you say is the technical level of your advocates and community health workers? Do you all feel confident in terms of helping folks learn how to create an email and all of that, or what do you kind of feel there as far as capacity?
Yeah, most of my team, they're pretty well. They're pretty their skills are pretty good in regards of technology. And so they do assist clients in walking them step by step over the phone. If needed, if the actually last resort, then we do see them in person, but that's kind of the last resort. But we really try to empower our clients, because I think that is what's going to help them to be able to accomplish and be able to become self-sufficient and not depend on someone else for always, opening up an email or, trying to navigate certain things. So we're at the same time, we're assisting them, but at the same time, we're empowering them as well too. And if needed, we write down the steps word for word, so then they can kind of follow those steps to kind of really empower them and help them become self-sufficient on their own. And if it takes 5 times, you know what? It's okay. It takes 5 times. And then they get to the next level, and then we're like, great, let's move on to the next one, and so on and so on. So it's just those little steps, and those makes a huge difference, I think. And eventually they feel empowered and feel proud of themselves after.
Well, yeah, I think you're taking the right approach. Are there issues that you'd like to kind of troubleshoot or have questions on or would like to talk through? That's what this last piece of this is what I'm hoping to do, is as many of you as want to bring up issues. Again, if I can answer them and we can kind of talk through them, we will. If not, I've got a notebook right here and I'm taking notes. We have some information in terms of resources for how to set up an email, how Facebook works, some pretty basic information. I will get those to you. There's pamphlets in English, Spanish, and I believe we have Tongan. But I can get you those 3 things so that you can print them and use them however, if they're helpful to you. So I've made a note of that. But are there other issues that you're seeing?
In our community, we're up in Cache County, Utah. We seem to get the most response actually using social media. We have tried to put it out to our clients to see if we have any interest doing like groups and workshops by Zoom. And with our Spanish community, we haven't gotten a good response that way. So we're waiting till we are approved to do in person again, so that we can do those ones. But doing like social media education and like through Facebook especially, we've gotten a really good response. Communicating with our Hispanic community that way. Definitely Zoom has not been a good resource for that specific community, but we've been able to use that for other groups and workshops so far.
That's helpful.
If you have any tips on how to get, like, I don't know if being able to explain how to use Zoom would help, or if it's just a cultural thing. We've got some great outreach workers that specifically work with our Hispanic community, so that's been a huge help, but we haven't been able to do online workshops and groups in Spanish yet.
Yeah, what I would encourage you to do is to find out what technology your school district is using or was using when schools went digital. what we tend to see is folks will have like one technology that they are comfortable using. And generally, and this is true in Salt Lake County, in some of the digital equity work we've done. It may be a little different in your community, but what we found is we were working with another organization that does WIC applications and kind of social services. And what they were seeing, like you were, is that the Latin community here wouldn't use Zoom. But that was because the school district was using a very specific kind of technology. And I can't remember if this was in Salt Lake City or in Granite School District, but they weren't using Zoom. They were using a different one. And so for that community, the kids that were going to school were using an entirely different technology. And by switching the organization we were working with, I believe we switched them from Zoom, I gotta remember the name of it, to Cisco. It transformed the access issues there because many of the folks they were trying to reach had children or were the grandparents of children who were using that technology for school. And so it was on a computer at home. And I know this is kind of an apples and oranges comparison to victim advocacy, but that would be what I would encourage you to do, is find out what technology was deployed in your school district or in the 2 school districts up there, as a way of figuring out maybe what technologies were already out there and kind of socialized with the folks that you're working with. And many of the school districts did trainings for parents. And I know that this has been, the parents on the call are probably rolling their eyes because it was such a quick transition. There wasn't a lot of training done, but many of the school districts did provide that. Whether it reached parents is a different story. So it may work if you find out, for example, in Logan that they're using WebEx instead of Zoom for school, or were using it. It may make sense to look at your agency and maybe potentially switch over to the technology the school was using instead of the technology that you plan to use, Zoom. And for some of these technologies, and if someone would put this in the chat so you all have access to it, I would encourage you to look up TechSoup, TechSoup.org. For those of you, especially that work at nonprofit agencies, but many government agencies, TechSoup allows you to buy technologies and software and even computers at a heavily discounted rate. It's meant to be a social service for nonprofits and for, I believe, government agencies and school districts are covered now as well. So you can often purchase, so you don't have to pay the full cost of WebEx or Cisco. You can often purchase them cheaper through TechSoup.org. So as you're looking at your technology, first, for those of you in an area where schools went online, and I believe it was statewide, find out what technology your school district was using, find out what resources they provided to parents in terms of training, and then if possible, align your organization with those technologies because you'll have an audience that will be more familiar with them. But it's still hit and miss because in Salt Lake City, almost 40% of the kids who took home a laptop and had online school never logged in and never did any homework that way. So again, there's no one size fits all, but I think in terms of simplicity, finding out what was socialized through the school district is going to make it easier for you to align with communities.
Turner, one of the comments in the chat feature was, we are redoing our website. So this is a good reminder to keep in mind. And so I thought on that question, what are some good tips for what makes a good, accessible website?
Yes. So the first is the rule of 3. You never want someone to have to click more than 3 times to end up with the information that you want them to have. So as you think of redesigning your website, that is one thing that I would really encourage you to do. Is simplicity and brevity are an art form in websites. And the way that we navigate information when we're going to a website, most of us, when we go to a website, we're not just going there blind, meaning we're not just looking up, UCASA's website and just kind of poking around. When folks come to your website, most of them will be coming with an agenda or with a goal for the whole reason that they're going to your website. So what I would think, as you're designing your website and you're rebuilding it, I would think as if you were going to it, what 3 steps make the most sense for you to get the information you're looking for? So if you say, download our client intake form on our website, and that's the instruction you give maybe on a social media post or in a communication, or you say it, to a client over the phone. If they go to your website and they can't find it within 3 clicks, the chances of them completing that paperwork and accomplishing the task and ever coming back to your website are dramatically decreased. So simplicity is very important. The other thing that I would say is mobile accessibility. The vast majority of people access websites from their phone and not from a desktop. And this is especially true from social media, which is, I'm assuming, where a lot of you are seeing folks where you're seeing engagement right now is on social media. When folks are on social media and they see a post, they immediately go to the website. And if the website is not mobile enabled, they won't save it, they won't come back to it. They just won't use it. So mobile accessibility, simplicity, and then the last thing that I would say is don't be afraid of attaching and linking documents, but make sure that you follow the simplicity guidelines, because if you have a bunch of content on there that's out of date, that's not accessible, that's not usable, and this is especially important when people are coming to you through Google or through search engines. The way that they work is, let's say they're looking for the Center for Women and Children in Crisis in Utah County, and they say, CWCIC, and they say victim paperwork or something like that, a pretty simple basic search. If you have a whole bunch of old language on your website that uses victim information or victim packet or paperwork, what they're going to do is they're going to be provided all of those old pages before the new page because of the way that the search engines work. So I would encourage simplicity, because the less information people have to navigate, the quicker they can find the information they're looking for. And then the third piece of this that simplicity feeds is, if you have a simple website without a lot of content, translating it becomes much easier. So another thing that I would encourage you all to use, it's called Hemingway Editor. And if someone could put that in the chat, I would appreciate it. Hemingway Editor is I think it's $20, and it goes in it's basically an app that you can download. So whoever your communications person is, or if it's you, you can download Hemingway Editor, and what it does is it will tell you what language or what level the language that you've written something is in. So it will you type out these words here. What issues are you seeing in your work? If you put that into Hemingway Editor, it will tell you that it's between a 7th grade and then a post-college level. And why that is so important is the higher you go in language complexity, the harder the translation becomes. And so if you keep language simple and you keep it accessible, it may seem very basic to you as someone who's comfortable with the language, but to someone who's coming into the field, especially someone who's been victimized, who's dealing with a trauma response, you all know that the amount of information that they can consume is limited because of the way that their brain is already overloaded. So what I would encourage you to do is make your website, again, simplicity, 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 and use Hemingway Editor to get your language on your website, when applicable and when possible, down to between a 7th and a 9th grade reading level. And what that will do is it will make it easier when someone comes to your website to translate it. Many folks who have a language barrier can still recognize words and word patterns. So if you simplify the language and you make it very accessible in terms of simplification, folks can still navigate that information even if it isn't translated. And then the last piece of it is, once you have a simple, mobile-friendly, easy-to-navigate website with just the best content on it, what you can do is then you can explore, if you use WordPress to build it, or Wix, or any of these service providers, many of them have an automatic translation feature that you can install as a plugin. And the person building your website will be able to do this easily. And what that will do is it's never perfect, and Google Translate can translate some things very weird. But what it does is it just adds one more layer of accessibility. And so a Google Translate can translate simple language much easier than it can translate complex language. So if you can avoid jargon and instead explain the process, instead of saying, I'm struggling with examples, but if you can avoid jargon and simplify language, then Google Translate can help translate that for you in a much simpler and cleaner way. It's when we get into complex things and complex sentence structure that Google Translate has a hard time. So Hemingway Editor, I swear by it. I use it constantly, and I would encourage you all to as well. Anything else? Trying to remember what my, oh yeah.
Hey, Turner, I have a question. This is Julie Jacobson. And working in the criminal and working for nonprofit, how much is the defense counsel is going to be able to use our phones and our computers and use it for their benefit? Because we're doing this all digital and we're helping our victims. Because like some of them have, some of us have 2 phones, some of us only have 1, some of us have a home computer, you know what I'm saying? Like computers, can they take that, use it for their, their cases, and then do we get it back? I mean, saying that is a huge thing now. Yeah, and I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that. What I would caution folks, and I, we talk about this as part of our media literacy information, is that anything that's online by its very nature is less private than anything offline. So text messages, for example, you can get a text message, a printout of text messages. You can access the search. When I say you, I mean in a court case, they can access someone's search history. So the thing about digital spaces is they will always leave more of a trail than good old-fashioned in-person, non-technological stuff. That being said, most of the companies, Facebook and others, Facebook has a bad rap for a lot of its technology stuff. Some of the things that they do really well are in terms of protecting communications. So Facebook's messages are what's called end-to-end encrypted, meaning that if someone were to try to hack your Facebook messages, and I know this is an extreme example, but if they were to try to hack your Facebook messages, they wouldn't be able to do it because it's, or the average person or the average hacker would not be able to do that. Usually what they have to do is have access to the cell phone or the computer that those communications happened on in the first place. So as far as
being able to answer how defense can use it. I'm not sure that I can do that. I would just say to be very cautious when using digital technologies because they will create a permanent record or a trail of sorts.
Okay, thank you.
And there are some things like WhatsApp. WhatsApp is very popular. WeChat is also popular. I think WhatsApp is probably the most secure in terms of communications. But what I will do is I'll look that up, Julie, and I'll find out. I'll email our national partner because I guarantee they've had this conversation with someone else across the country. So let me email them about privacy and technologies they recommend for confidential communications.
Yeah, because if they take your phone, then you can't work with the next victim. Let's say they want it for evidence and you have a trial or something. I mean, it's so open. And so I don't know how to protect them, but we use our phones every day and taking pictures. Like the other guy said, he's taking pictures for like all the documents and stuff like that and trying to take to the courts. I mean, can you use that? You know what I'm saying? They can take your phone maybe for the evidence part. And that's what I'm asking. Like, how do we protect ourselves too, and our clients?
And even the thinking, this situation where I've been helping this family in my neighborhood, if they were involved in a court case, could then my computer be seized because I was doing the scanning for them? And could there be an allegation that I manipulated information or something like that? And I don't have the answer to that just because I think we've all transitioned online so quickly. But that's something I'll reach out to our national partners and see if they have information on that.
All right, thanks, Turner.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right. Is there anything in the chat?
Just a lot of thank yous. Great information. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. I'm happy to keep answering things. I am at the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to keep going through questions. The three takeaways that I really want to leave you with is that digital equity work is fundamentally about access to resources and technology, and it's about the skills to use them. If we only focus on access and we only focus on the technology and we don't focus on the skills, we leave vulnerable people even more vulnerable in our world. And the second is that systemic vulnerabilities make this problem worse. Most people don't choose where they live, at least for the formative parts of their lives. And so when we have housing instability, redlining, disinvestment in communities, it leaves people vulnerable intergenerationally. And we're in this really, really interesting time where we're rapidly adapting to a digital world. School can go online, healthcare can go online, but those systemic vulnerabilities leave people out of that economy, and we can't do that. So the last thing is that victim advocates have a role to play, and I would add that you have a unique role to play in digital equity work, because you are dealing with folks regardless of how well resourced they are, regardless of how what their demographics or their economics are. You are dealing with folks at a time when they are the most vulnerable, and this is true of someone who makes $100,000 a year and is victimized, or someone who is barely making it and is victimized. That you all are working with folks at a unique time in their lives, and what we know about the trauma response is that it impacts information gathering, it impacts information storage and memory, and it impacts decision making, and there can be lifelong consequences for the use of technology. And I say this not to scare anyone, not to say that technology is bad, but when you think about, for example, a victim of sexual assault, As you all know, anything that they post on social media, anything that they say publicly can be used against them. And yet, for young people who've grown up with social media is not separate and distinct from their lives. We tend to think of ourselves with our online lives and our offline lives, and that's not how it is. All of it is interconnected, and especially for young people, social media can be a major source of self-expression, self-actualization, of healing, and if they don't have the skills to understand the permanence of that, then we leave them increasingly vulnerable. And so you all as victim advocates have such an important role to play. And we at Utah Communities Connect, myself, we are very interested in helping you. So if situations come up and you have, there's going to be a lot of things that we can't answer right now, but what we want to do is work with you. We're here as a resource, and I would love to support you all as you move forward, and work with you, CASA and UDVC, to provide that kind of information on the digital divide and the ways that we can bridge it. So I really appreciate your time today, and I'm happy to stay on if folks have things they want to talk about, questions, other issues that have come up, but I'm also happy to end early and give you some of your time back today.
Marguerite says in the chat, if victims are still in the home and the abuser has access to their emails, phones, it's going to be challenging to communicate with them.
Absolutely. And the other thing that it opens up the door to do is if someone has access to your Facebook or your email, they can falsify records that can then be obtained by the defense or others. And then the victim ends up in a situation where they're having to prove that those communications were not initiated or created by them. And so technology itself can be a form of exploitation and a form of vulnerability. And the other thing about this is the skills training creates a protective factor against that type of thing. You all may remember when the first public internet was coming out, and they had it at the waiting rooms at doctors' offices, and they had public computers in the computer lab and at the library. One of the things they had to put up was a sign that says, "Please sign out of your accounts," because people would sign in and assume that as soon as they turn the computer off, that they would sign out of their Facebook account. But those kinds of practices aren't necessarily built in with folks that don't have a lot of comfort with their own computer or with technology. So myself, having grown up with a Facebook since I was in, I think, high school or junior high, I would know if I went to the movie theater to sign out of my Facebook account. But someone who doesn't have those skills may not. And then their entire history, their messages, all of their communications are left vulnerable because they're still logged in. So absolutely, access and someone else having access to these technologies is critically important, or can be incredibly detrimental to folks.
Nancy wants to know, are there resources for free internet for clients that cannot afford internet services?
Yes. So Comcast Digital Essentials is one that I would point you to. And I will get you a resource sheet with all of this information. In fact, if you'll give me just 1 second, I can pull this up. And then I'll make sure that I'll make sure it's sent out. I have access to it right now.
Kathy wants to know, what about rural areas where Comcast is not available?
There are some additional resources available for rural areas. What I'm gonna share in the chat.
Or you can email it to me and I can put it in the Google Drive as well.
Okay, this is a Google Drive link. And if you have issues accessing it, I will fix those access issues. The other person that I would encourage you to be familiar with is the Utah State Library. This is incredibly important for rural communities. The Utah State Library and archive can provide resources. They are looking at doing, some of the school districts have done Wi-Fi on buses. A lot of the libraries statewide are looking at doing take-home hotspots. So this link opens up to a variety of different resources. And then I have more that I can email you, Rochelle. Make sure that you have all that. But I will, I'll make sure that I get that over to you ASAP. So I know of Comcast Internet Essentials off the top of my head. I know that CenturyLink has one, but I'll have to get you the information.
Excellent, thank you.
And I see Alan's question. As far as algorithms and bots, one of the things that's going to hurt you as victim service providers on social media is the way that Facebook's algorithm works is that it provides people with the information that they want to see. And this is not, that's an overly reduced explanation. But one of the things that we're seeing a problem with is that the folks who generally follow you are folks that have already benefited from you, or that are, advocates or volunteers, or are already tuned into the work that you're doing. So I think of, for example, the Rape Recovery Center and UDVC. Many folks that follow them, and that this is not all the folks that follow them, but many of the folks that do follow them support them as supporters. The problem is that the folks who we need to reach with a message about support are not already following the pages. So what I would encourage you all to do to help combat this is, one, try to get your pages verified. And if we wanted to do like a class or a quick training on how to do that, I'd be happy to do that. I don't know that it's appropriate to do today, but I'd be happy to do that if your communications folks need help with that. But get your pages verified. And then the other thing is, have a budget for boosting posts if possible. And I know this will, the system advocates will roll your eyes at me about adding money to your budget for boosting social media posts. But Facebook's algorithm rewards pages that boost and pages that just share organically. So if you can boost some posts and kind of mix it up. And then as far as courts, mental health, and other services, the thing about the algorithms is, and I like what Alan said, is that wants to see translates to will make them angry. But social media responds to engaging content. So if people are liking and sharing your content, it actually boosts you in the algorithm. So if there's ways of working with some of your volunteers, and some of you maybe that manage advocacy response teams and you have a couple of volunteers, if you could coordinate and say, on Tuesday at 4 o'clock, we're going to share a post with resources. Will you share that out and have them share it in the yard sale group and have them share it in, be that annoying person that gets the information out there. Algorithms reward that kind of thing as well, that the organic sharing of content. And if we wanted to do a social media presentation and that kind of thing, I'd be absolutely happy to help you do that. But verify your pages and then boost some if you can, and then organically share it as much as possible. All right, anyone else?
Before we see if there's another question, I just wanted to encourage everyone who's attending today to click on the link to fill out our survey for this SWAVO.
You're welcome, Indy. Thank you. And Rochelle, you have my contact information. Please feel free to share that. If you have questions that come up, if you need me to search something for you, find out information, let me know, and I'm happy to do that and have Utah Communities Connect help.
Good. We really, I mean, I really appreciate, because I just think sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And I had no idea. I mean, I knew that I wasn't as savvy as some should be. So when I first started my job and they said, oh, go to this Google Drive, I was like, I'm not familiar with that. And, you know, I knew I had to learn some things, but I just didn't, you just kind of assume that everyone can access what you can access. And so I feel like this was just a good presentation to let victim advocates know that don't assume that victims can access things. So don't just say, you know, here, fill it out online, because they may not have that ability. And so I think it was a good conversation to have, and I appreciate you coming today. I appreciate Utah Communities Connect. What a cool organization, and all that you do. And we do an annual, we're figuring out how to do it this year. It may end up waiting until the spring, but we do an annual conference on digital equity issues, and we record all of the sessions. So I'll make sure that I get those to you as well. Excellent. Good. Well, good. Well, can hang out for a little bit, but thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for joining. I love this part, because this is always the part that you get to see like who just turned their camera on and has walked away, and they just hang out on the call for another 40 minutes.
That's funny, because I really just need to go and click on the link to do my survey.
Oh, do you want me to put it back in there, Maria?
No, it's in there. I'm copying all these resources and sharing them with my team. And so I'm like, oh, I need to do this. And then I need to go get that survey, because there were so many good resources shared. I need to share them with the rest of my team. Excellent. So thanks, Turner. That was really good. That was very interesting and informative.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Turner.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you, Rochelle. Bye.
Thank you.
Good to see everyone. Thanks for turning your camera on. I miss you all.
All right. It doesn't look like there's any other questions, so I'll go ahead and drop off.
Good. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. It was great.
And if things come up, just send me questions. You know how to get a hold of me.
Good. Thank you. We really enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you.
Hi, Rochelle. Can you put the link up one more time?
The survey link?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There it is. Hi, Maddie.
Hi. Good SWAVO.
Well, put it in the survey, please.
I will, because you like your numbers.
Yes. Well, my grant likes my numbers, Maddie. Did you feel like so much of what he was saying about helping the older generation applied to us?
Oh, it was beautiful. I am you some more and laugh at you.
Oh, thank you for not doing that. Gabriella, just click directly on the link in the form and it will take you there.
You might want to stop recording.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Maddie.